discovered in the alluvial plains between the third and fourth cataracts of the Nile. The ruins of the city of Kerma baffled its discoverers. George Reisner, confronted by the skeleton of what was at one point no doubt a complex and sophisticated Bronze Age metropolis, was sure that it was the work of ancient Egyptian colonizers. There was no way in his mind that a city of such splendor could have been built by the native Nubians. Unsurprisingly, he was far from the mark in his analysis. His assessment came not from a real and sincere attempt at identifying the builders of the city. He, weighed down by the social baggage of 1800s America, just couldn't bring himself to believe any differently. In the early 2nd millennium BC, Kerma, the capital of the Kingdom of Kerma, was a city of over 10,000 inhabitants. The main settlement was flanked by monumental buildings to its east and west, and would have inspired a sense of awe and power from its rivals and subjects, in the same way it did in Reisner. But it wasn't always this way. In the centuries prior, Kerman power was centered almost entirely within the confines of the second and third cataracts of the Nile, bordered by the powerful sea group chiefdoms of what to their immediate north, the militaristic Medjay to their east, a mysterious sister group to their south, and with the agro-pastoral Pontics just southeast of them. Egypt, while being the region's hegemon, was comfortably far enough from Kerma that they were limited to trading partners for the initial phases of Kerma and Kush. Contrary to Reisner's statements, the complex culture that led to the erection of the mud brick buildings that towered over the vast lowlands of the Dongola Reach was an indigenous one. The city of Kerma was the culmination of 2,000 years of Nubian progress, from the newly stratified Neolithic societies of Lower Nubia to arguably the first kingdom in sub-Saharan Africa. The earliest people we can confidently identify as ancestors of Kermans were the first food-producing communities of the Middle Nile, who likely migrated into the region sometime in the 6th millennium BC from further north. Enamel-dentine junction analysis on remains from Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic Nubians has revealed clues of significant population replacement all along the Middle Nile, from the first cataract to south of the fifth cataract and the Atbara confluence. The forager population seemingly vanished from the record and were replaced by a biologically distinct population of pastoralists who would kickstart the Neolithic cultures that would give birth to the city of Kerma. Of these, the earliest truly complex Nubian culture was the tragically named A-group culture, based in Lower Nubia, northern Nubia that is, from 3800 BC. Here, the first signs of social stratification are observed, mostly in burials, but evidence of a complex society can also be seen in sites like Afia, where the stone houses would differ in size, some with up to 6 rooms. Sometime around the end of the 4th millennium BC, for reasons not entirely understood, the A-group culture would collapse, and there would be a hiatus in the building of complex settlements in Lower Nubia for some centuries. Most chalk it up to one of two scenarios: increased military pressure exerted by nascent Egyptian dynasties, resulting in annexation, or a decrease in the flooding of the Nile, leading to food shortages and subsequently the collapse of the proto-states. Further south, by 3500 BC, the pre-Kerma culture, the culture just prior to the emergence of Kerma proper, was taking root. It's still up in the air whether or not the people of Kerma directly descend from the A-group, but osteological studies on Kerma and the A-group seem to support a theory in which they were somewhat related. Pottery analysis, an ever useful tool in determining relations between archaeological cultures, too has drawn similarities between the ceramics produced by the people of pre-Kerma and that of the A-group. These give us clues as to the origins of the earliest settlers of the city. It's through rigorous use of tools like ancient DNA and osteology that we are able to know, as much as we know about the origins of these people and their place in the ancient world. Further studies done on remains from Kerma seem to suggest that the population of the city would have been pretty heterogeneous, but with the bulk of the population being most similar to the populations of modern Northeast Africa. But again, at times the city was pretty heterogeneous. There existed a separate cluster that was more morphologically similar to modern Kenyans, likely representing a Nilotic adjacent or forager-related population. Though limited, DNA analysis also points to genetic affinities with intermediary populations of modern Northeast Africa, namely the Oromo, Tigrinya, and unsurprisingly, modern Nubians. From an early burial at Kadruka dated to 2000 BC and linked to the emerging Kerma kingdom, researchers recovered genetic data linking the individual to ancient East African pastoralist groups, themselves very similar to modern Horn African populations, either due to a lack of archaeological work in Upper Nubia compared to Lower Nubia, or a scarcity in sites that can be conclusively linked to the immediate predecessors of Kerma. There remains a severe gap in our understanding of the cultural landscape that set the stage for the kingdom's emergence. Most of what we know comes from a humble 10-hectare agglomeration trapped beneath Kerma's famous Eastern Cemetery, dating to the 4th millennium BC. Two very prominent parts of this early habitation site that give us invaluable information on the lifestyle of its inhabitants were the cattle pens and storage pits. The cattle pens, considering the preceding pastoral cultures of Upper Nubia, are to be expected. Throughout the Kerma period, cattle continued to play a vital role in everyday life, from subsistence to cultural expression. The storage pits, of which there were probably 500 of them, contained jars that at one point stored grains such as barley and emmer wheat, meaning they grew, or at least had access to, crops. Access to Middle Eastern cereals instead of East African sorghum hints at pre-existing connections with Egypt and by extension the Mediterranean world predating 3500 BC. The most important parts of this particular pre-Kerma settlement in following the sun-baked ignites that eventually lead to sub-Saharan Africa's first kingdom are initially unassuming. In a settlement where most live in round huts, typical of the Neolithic the world over, there could be seen the remains of two rectangular buildings, more similar in style to the mud brick homes of Kerma 1,000 years later. Perhaps these were built to fulfill administrative purposes or other stately functions, or even as places of worship. When considering that in other pre-Kerma sites, such as at Sai Island, mud sills with governmental designs were found, the presence of administrative and/or religious organization that would necessitate such buildings isn't far-fetched. The Kerma period formally began in the 26th century BC, with the first of its three phases, Kerma Ancienne. To understand why the city was built where it was and how Kerma came to be the preeminent power of Nubia, it's important to really understand one of Kerma's main strengths, its geography. The city sat in one of the most strategically charged stretches of the entire Nile Valley, called the Dongala Reach, consisting of 100 kilometers of fertile floodplain, rare in a region that's mostly dry, rocky, and unforgiving. In this respect, it was a refuge of order from the chaos surrounding it, and that formed the essence of the city's character. The river here spreads out wide, with islands, natural leaves, and soil rich enough to feed large cities, and armies to protect them. The cataracts to its north and south were natural choke points, dangerous, rocky areas of river that made navigation a nightmare. As a result, trade had to slow down, and armies had to disembark, and that gave Kerma control. The city itself was built on elevated ground, just above flood level, with the western Defufa, the mud brick monolith that still dominates the skyline, built facing the river. Everything about the layout of the city pointed back to the Nile. Every district and every feature was oriented around the river, like spokes on a wheel. Food, trade, faith, all based on the will of that river. The Nile gave the land power, and for the next 1,000 years, no one would wield it better. It was with this in mind that the first builders of the city would build the city where it was, so close to the Nile. With the city also came the earliest burials in the Eastern Cemetery, built on top of the freshly entombed pre-Kerma agglomeration, where tens of thousands would later be laid to rest. And it's thanks to the over 40,000 tombs in the Eastern Cemetery that we are able to know what we do about Kerma. One striking burial is of a man who lived in the same century as the famous Amesbury archer, who likely lived a relatively similar life of being a warrior under a militaristic aristocracy. He too was laid to rest with his bows, along with highly prized pottery and a plume of ostrich feathers, and his body facing east as was the tradition in Kerma. His burial stands as early materialistic evidence for the enduring Nubian archer tradition that would come to define military strategy in the Middle Nile, from the era of Tarseti until the invention of guns. The burials were also systematic and stereotyped, typical of warlike cultures. Whereas women would be buried with ornaments or pottery tools, males as young as 4 years old would be buried with their bows. This may seem surprising, but if you were to look a little deeper, the reason why such a tradition would evolve in a place like Kerma becomes abundantly clear. And that's because the society that these people lived in was a very violent one. A common feature across many of the burials dated to the Kerma Ancien period had signs of physical trauma, likely from the wars fought with nearby polities whom they would eventually absorb. As was the case in the very earliest Egyptian dynasties, Kerma royals would also be buried with retainers, perhaps meant as companions in the afterlife. Funerary sacrifice at the earlier stages, however, more commonly took the form of animal sacrifice. Endless quantities of goats, sheep, and cattle were slain and likely consumed on the days of a noble's burial. While most of the material would be discarded, the wealthy would style their graves with cattle crania lined in a semicircular fashion to flaunt their wealth. That might seem strange to us now, but in ancient Kerma, cattle were everything. You could barter anything for some healthy cows. Weapons, pottery, grains, metals. For kings in particular, decorating their gravesite with the heads of sacrificed cattle would be an exercise of power. How many tribes they ruled over, and how much tribute they exacted from them. And that brings me to something that really needs to be driven home in any discussion on ancient Nubia. At this time period, there was no one Nubian people group. The Kermans were just one of many different peoples who lived south of Egypt and north of the confluence of the White and Blue Niles. The people in this region spoke many different languages from separate language families, and would have developed very different cultures from living in very different ecologies, and would have even looked very different from one another from what we can gather in the archaeological record. All of these groups would be vying for power in Nubia, with the Kermans just being the most successful. Calling all of these vastly distinct ethnic groups Nubians would be akin to calling all pre-Roman Italian ethnic groups from the Etrurians, Umbrians, Samnites, and even the Gauls in Cisalpine Gaul Roman, because they would later come under Rome's domain, speak Latin, and somewhat homogenize. In the context of Bronze Age Nubia, it's an anachronism at best and plain ignorant at worst. While those living in cities and villages under Kerma's control would have grown easily taxable crops, it becomes obvious that they would have ruled over many mobile pastoral tribes from the peripheries of riverine Sudan. It's easy to see, then, how cattle came to symbolize wealth and power. For every new tribe conquered, the more cattle to decorate your grave with. By Middle Kerma, around 2000 BC, one royal had close to 5,000 bucrania lining his grave. That's 5,000 individual cows slaughtered and consumed in his memory. Just trying to imagine an event so monumental in Bronze Age Nubia is a fascinating affair. Petty kings and tribal chiefs from all over Kerma's sphere of influence attending, hardened pastoralists from the peripheries mingling with peasant farmers as they all feast and drink to pay their respects. Indeed, isotope analysis on the cattle crania show that the cattle slaughtered came from many varied environments, suggesting that yes, these were brought as gifts by those previously conquered by Kerma. The question remains, though, of what this man in particular achieved in his lifetime that made it so that his burial had an order of magnitude more cattle crania than his contemporaries. Could this have been Kerma's very own Alexander? Unfortunately, as a result of the lack of written records in this time period, we will never know. Thanks to the abundant violence abound, Kerma was a city built with defense in mind. The city, during its foundation, featured substantial defensive architecture, including bastions positioned at strategic points, such as at corners and gates, constructed from jalis or packed mud. Ditches that would double as moats when necessary also surrounded key points of the city, some up to 23 feet deep. While the bastions and towers certainly offered protection against possible raids or invasions, their monumental scale and visibility also had symbolic functions. They signaled the power and stability of Kerma's rulers, authority both internally and over the chaos that the outsiders had to endure. While the pastoralists faced growing hardship from an increasingly aridifying Sahara, non-Kerman farmers had to contend with their increasingly frequent raids without the protection of Kerma's defensive architecture.
Toward the end of the Kerma Ancien period, as Upper Nubia became more unified under their rule, and as the population grew, it was only now that the building of the Western Dafufa began. Nowadays, its ragged, threadbare outer walls hide empty labyrinthine chambers, but 4,000 years ago, it looked more like this, resembling a fortress in shape, which explains why its earliest European discoverers confused it for one, with a network of ramps and stairways leading to the upper levels where religious ceremonies would take place. At 24 meters high, it would have been visible on the horizon 4 kilometers to the east at the Eastern Cemetery, and would officially qualify as a high-rise building in the USA. Directly in front of the gates of the city were two large rectangular buildings enclosed by a rounded wall approximately 30 meters long. This structure, significantly larger than the others from the same period, has been identified by archaeologist Charles Bonnet as the royal residence. Kerma's palace was made up of two building blocks flanking a shared courtyard. It included kitchens, storage rooms, two large grain silos, and an archive room for royal seals, forming a self-contained royal compound. Near the entrance of the palatial complex was a large hall, interpreted as the throne room, that likely served as a formal reception space for visitors, vassals, and envoys. Adjacent to the palace stood the Great Hut, a large circular structure situated at a strategic crossroads near the main entrance to the Western Dafufa. Measuring about 12 meters in diameter, the Great Hut was initially likely constructed of wood, only later rebuilt in mud brick. Its interior featured a ring of pillars, probably to support a conical or domed roof, while the entrance included a portico, a kind of covered porch, supported by additional columns, and it remained in continuous use for the next 600 years. While we can't know for sure, this building likely functioned as a meeting place for high officials or the nobility of Kerma. Around this time, Kerma became an important player in the trade of goods from the African interior up into the Mediterranean states of the Bronze Age. Some scholars identify Kerma with the state of Yam, visited by Harkuf, an Egyptian monarch of the 6th dynasty. In his autobiography, Harkuf recounts bringing gifts to the powerful king of Yam, 300 donkeys laden with incense, ebony, animal skins, and throw stakes. Pleased, the king sent his army to escort Harkuf through Lower Nubia, intimidating local states into offering tribute and forging ties with Egypt. New discoveries in the Western Desert, however, have cast doubt on the theory that Yam was in Upper Nubia, and the connection between Kerma and Yam. Regardless, remnants of Kerman material presence are found all over Nubia and Egypt, and as far away as Mahal Teglunos in modern Eritrea, the likely location of the semi-mythical land of Punt. Kerma's intercontinental network would endure and soon extend beyond just trade. The 21st century BC is also where we get our first mention of Kush from the Egyptians, which is how they refer to the kingdom that was centered in the city of Kerma. Still, for clarity's sake, I will still refer to the people as Kermans and the state of Kush. But in reality, this was the first kingdom of Kush, nearly 2,000 years before the famous 25th dynasty. This is the first of two parts in the Kerma culture. In the next video, we will talk about Kerma's golden age, Kerma Classique, as well as its brutal decline at the hands of New Kingdom Egypt. We will also assess whether or not Kerma classifies as Africa's first empire. If you would like to be notified of the release of part 2, please subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, a like would go a long way. Until next time.